All right, welcome, welcome. I am thrilled to be able to introduce this panel. My name is Whitney, and I'm with the foundation. And today in this room, it's about community. That's what we're focused on, about building community and nurturing community. And so we are going to talk about making for all and how to craft a national dialogue around the maker movement and building community and moving it forward. So I'm going to introduce to you the moderator very briefly and the three panelists. They will be speaking for about 3/4 of the time, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. I have a microphone that I will run around the room to you during the Q&A period, so just be certain that you speak into the microphone to ask your question so that it will be show up on the video that we are recording. Otherwise, you won't be able to be heard. So I will definitely be running that to you. Okay, so I am thrilled first to introduce to you Kumar Garg, who is a senior fellow at the Society for Science and the Public. And he is a leading policymaker and strategist to the Society's mission of cultivating scientific understanding among children and adults. And most people know Kumar from his work at the Obama White House. It's sort of like you'll never leave that identity. Once you've been in the Obama White House, it's like in your bio for the rest of your life. Even if you go to become a basket weaver, it'll still be referenced.
Positive memory.
Yes. And has done an amazing work in bringing STEM, computer science education, making to our country over the last 10 years. I also would like to introduce to his right is Leigh and DeLyser. And, sorry, I just lost my place on my, I put them all on my phone. Leanne is a lifelong advocate for computer science education and is managing partner for CSforALL. Leanne oversees research and implementation programs that all align to the organization's strategic goals. Also, we have, to her right, Stephanie Couch, who is the executive director of Lemelson-MIT program. She's been there since July 2016, and she's dedicated her career to K-12 and higher education policy issues in school finance and educational technology in California. And to her right is Kyle Cornforth, executive director of Maker Ed, very new executive director. And she comes to the Maker movement from an amazing other movement, which is really also the Maker movement, which is the Edible Schoolyard Project, which is all about food and accessibility to food and making our nation's nutrition. So it's a pretty cool transfer of knowledge that you're gonna bring. Their Twitter handles are on the board up here. And again, if you tweet during this session, hashtag #MakeForAll and hashtag InfyXroads are good handles to use. And I will turn it over to Kumar and be back for Q&A. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody. So I want to thank the Infosys Foundation for bringing us here to this incredible location and for all of you joining. Now, one thing I'm going to warn Whitney before she runs away is one thing I love to do before we really get a conversation going with our esteemed panel is to really collect questions from all of you. So about what you would love this conversation to cover. So you can all start thinking because we're going to call on you before we start. But the context for this conversation is really one of the things that I think is a real advantage of the way Infosys has actually approached this, which is I know all of you who are actually working in this space find the distinctions sometimes between making and computer science to be really present in your work or not present at all. And actually these distinctions kind of collapse on top of each other. But I think the idea of actually bringing these two communities into the same conference is actually really useful. I've seen from past years that really interesting overlaps come. And part of what the goal of this conversation was to actually really grapple with how these communities intersect. So a couple questions that sort of drove the creation of this panel when we sort of tried to think about it a couple months ago. One was there's been a real explosion of interest in computer science. It's rapidly increasing in access in schools. There are big questions around equity. That explosion, especially in the formal side of education, I think raises really interesting questions for what can the maker community learn from it. So what are ways that folks who are interested in expanding access to making, what can they learn from the computer science community, especially the framing of computer science for all, which I think has been a real explicit idea around equity and around access that has really taken the movement in the past couple of years. So I think that's one question that sort of animates this conversation, and I'd love to get thoughts from our panel when we get to them. The second is, I think one really powerful thing that's happened in the computer science community is the growth of what I call organizations that really serve as servant leaders. Organizations that are not just focused on providing direct programming, but have taken on the hard task of actually saying, we want to be force multipliers for the overall space. That's something we in the White House cared about a lot, in the Obama White House. But I think the rise of organizations like the Computer Science for All Consortium and other organizations in the makerspace are doing some of this work, and we want to sort of think about what are the challenges and needs of servant leadership. And then finally, one question I think I continue as somebody who works in the, with the computer science and maker community is to just to keep the conversation going about what's missing and what are ways that organizations in the space can continue to work more closely together and coordinate. So those were some of the underlying thoughts, and we said, hey, let's frame it around a make for all conversation. How can we learn across these communities, and how can the maker community learn across it? So that's the broad context, but I would love, before we get the thoughts of our experts, to get your questions in the mix as to why are you spending your precious time sitting in this panel. So I would love name, organization, and your question.
And I have the microphone, so just raise your hand.
Right here.
So I'd be interested to hear some specific talking points about getting us to the point that diversity is no longer a nice to have, but a necessary component of survival.
And your name and organization.
Ani Martinez from the Remake Learning Network.
Great. Who else has a question?
Hi, Valerie Carno. I'm the director of the Grad School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Rhode Island. And my question is, what are some of the best ways to move things from a state to a national level around maker education?
Great. Yes.
Unfortunately, if you're not on the mic, it doesn't pick up in the video.
Good morning. Nicole Collins-Pori with TechBridge Girls. Because we're talking about movement, I wanted to know more about how do we really collectively create an agenda that we're all aligned moving toward the same goal, even though we may be acting kind of in our silo space of STEM or CS or maker, but how are we really coming together as one unified movement?
That's great. Hi, I love doing this.
I'm Maggie Malone, Director of K-12 STEM programs at Hartnell College in Salinas. And my question is, how do communities like ours, rural, very underserved, and very heavy on minorities, how do we make sure that people know what we're doing? Because we're doing a lot of stuff, but we're busy doing it.
Right.
And how do we connect to either bigger networks or national platforms, because it's really important what we're doing, and we could actually help people also do it. Because I go around and a lot of people are trying to figure out what to do, how to do it. We're doing it, but how do we connect with them, and how do we kind of show what Salinas, the little town of Salinas, is doing?
That's great. I feel like we're building on some of those opening questions around national voice, servant leadership. Yes?
Hi, I'm Michelle Lanier. I'm from Cincinnati Public Schools. And so I come from a curriculum perspective. And it's more or less, how do we make it more systemic, relevant to the classroom so that we're not engaged in a lot of random acts? We have a lot of things that are going on. We want to try to build it within a framework. How do we make it a framework that is sustainable so that we can have something we can point to say, here is where you start. Here's the connection of experts and support. Here's what it should look like. These are the types of experiences that are embedded in the curriculum that help students in developing not only technical skills, but the soft skills necessary for networking and for being able to be successful in life. So it's more or less, how do we make it more comprehensive and connected?
That's great. Yes?
Hi, Erin Hogeboom from the National Girls Collaborative Project. And first of all, shout out to Salinas, because I went to Salinas High. My question builds off of Nicole's question, which is, considering that this is a movement, who's missing? Who should be at the table, who's not here yet, and what are suggestions maybe that you have for getting them involved?
That's great. Brad?
Kip Bradford, multiple organizations. Yale pays my paycheck right now. My question goes back to the framing that Kumar put on the panel, which is the relationship between CS education and maker education. And I would like to hear about what objectives, or how the objectives of CS education differ from the objectives of maker education, and what impact that would have on scaling maker education in the same way that CS education has gained traction.
Albert.
Albert Palacios, U.S. Department of Education.
Around this time is when the panel starts to freak out. They're like, oh my God, this audience is expecting a lot, which is the right interaction.
So I'm going to piggyback on Kip's question, because I'm interested in understanding, not from the U.S. Department of Education's standpoint, but from the state departments of education, how Maker Ed and CS build into the state performance measures for teachers, because that's often the aim of the teachers, so they want to make sure that's covered. So how do you make sure that you're identifying what performance measures you're able to achieve for the teacher?
Great.
Tamra Pearson, Georgia Tech. I want to build directly off of what he said in terms of how is the National Maker Dialogue influencing educational policies so that it can exist inside of public education classrooms.
Hi, Zach Weaver, Building 61, Boulder Public Library Makerspace. I'm wondering, at what point does a blanket policy for CS or maker education stifle the organic diversity that pops up in informal learning spaces?
Great. Anybody else? Okay, so I think that was awesome. Congratulations to you all. So we'll sort of stack these into a couple of areas around what is it that we are all working on? What are some of the key roles around connection and building together? How do we tie this into work that matters in school and around all the performance and accountability systems that people have to operate in? But there's a bunch of different areas. But why don't we first start with this question about are CS and making different? Who would like to sort of grapple with that question? Are we in a joint enterprise and we're using different words? Or are we starting from different places and ending in different places?
I guess I'll start. I have the mic. So if you look at the types of things that students make in computer science classes and maker spaces, and the processes by which they get to those artifacts, right? Because it's not just about the outcome, it's about how they get there. I think there is a significant Venn diagram overlap between the two, right? There is core tenets of CS education about theory and underlying principles of algorithms like sorting that don't necessarily represent a core tenet of making, although they might make up a solution in a making problem. And there are core tenets of making, the ability to take physical materials and construct through an engineering process a solution that might not need a digital component, right? So that process is well aligned with some of the computer science processes, but not necessarily within the Venn diagram circle of what we would draw a circle around a computer science activity. So I think there's a significant overlap, but I see them as like two circles on a Venn diagram that share some common outcomes, especially around process, but not always common outcomes on product.
Stephanie, how do you think about this, given the many different hats you've worn over the years?
Yeah. So I am currently wearing a hat where we work with young people and in teams and their teachers across the U.S., and we help the educators and students find their problem that they want to solve in their local community, and then they build a technological solution to the problem, and in some cases they patent what they build. And so for us, you know, we have to think about how to help young people find problems worth solving, which is the hardest thing to do. That's where we struggle. And then it's how to think of how to find out what else is out there, how to design a solution, and then inevitably you have to develop your working prototype. And that's where making and computer science, to me, are different types of skill sets, but they're the kinds of tools you need in the tool bag. But by the way, you need a lot of other tools in the tool bag too. And so I've come to see that developing technological solutions to problems as an interdisciplinary act. And what we find is when we honor that young people can come to the teams and be engaged in the work who bring different strengths, not just computer science and not just making, that we get, that's how we get the diversity onto the teams. Girls join to be the project managers, people join to be the communications person. And in the course of building that solution, then they realize, oh, computer science can be for me too. Making and building with tools can be for me too. And then we really do see young people coming out from diverse backgrounds and females coming out saying, I think I want to pursue computer science. Or so I get back to, I love the idea of this stuff is great stuff. It has to get out of after-school programs. It has to get into the regular school day. And I think one of the ways to get it into the regular school day is to be able to show a framework that we all are part of, where we are drawing on what we're trying to teach in the science and engineering standards, what we're trying to teach in math, computer science, into a unifying framework like that. Otherwise, we're a bunch of one-off voices babbling, and we're never going to get anywhere because the traditional individual disciplines will always be in power.
So, you know, I feel like fresh eyes are always useful. And sometimes when fresh eyes look at a problem, they say, well, people are using different words for the same thing, or these are actually tribes talking. The underlying work is the same, or actually people are working on actually very different things. And what's your sense on, a couple months in, as to your sort of sense of this space and what feels familiar, what feels different?
Okay, so I agree with the Venn diagram metaphor, that there is a circle of computer science and there's a circle of making, and in the middle there's this sweet spot where we have an opportunity to blend the digital with the hands-on tinkering that we can do. And ultimately the goals seem to be the same, that we want to figure out how to provide an education for students in formal and informal settings where kids are able to access their own agency, they're able to solve problems, they're able to solve complex problems, and they're able to collaborate with people who are different than them to solve those problems, and that having those different perspectives is actually the key to us on like a human level being able to solve the larger complex problems of humanity and globalness that we're in. I think one of the challenges that I see for making is that it's so comprehensive, and makers are seem to be so scared of saying this is or this isn't making. Like everything is making. Gardening is making. Cooking is making. Sewing is making. Digital computing is making. And that's true. And at some point I think we could benefit from some shared and common language around what is making, why are we doing it, how does computer science support it as a tool, and ultimately both of these things are strategies towards a larger goal of making the world a more inclusive and safer place for everybody.
Great. So just to get on this question of, okay, so there is always a little bit of a challenge around defining what we are working on. I feel like the computer science space has always struggled with, hey, is this about these core skills, or is it about coding in a language? Is it about the underlying literacy? Is it actually about empowering students with a notion of agency in this rapidly? So like one way people say is like, oh, we're all in the fight to equip our kids to outrace the robots, right? That's like the actual endeavor we are in. We don't know what the future brings, and you're just trying to get them ready, and whatever ready means. I think part of the question I would have sort of as our next question is, part of what the way the computer science community sort of thought about this was, one, going more fundamental, not around skills and deeper notions of literacy. And the second was this move towards for all. And I feel like in the maker community, there's definitely a question around equity, but is putting the for all more front and center? Does that change the conversation, or does that help or not? It'd be interesting sort of like, how much should equity be at the center of the actual joint project when people were saying, hey, what is the joint mission that we are working on versus the individual programmatic thing? Does that actually help clarify, like, some kids are going to get this no matter what, some kids are going to be ready for that future no matter what. We're talking about, the equity lines. I'd be curious about how you all sort of approach the equity question, or the for all question.
Yeah, so the idea of definitions sounds easy. We've been writing definitions of words since we were in first grade, right? You get a word, here's the definition. And for me personally, defining computer science education has been a 10-year journey. So it started back in about 2007, 2008. I'd just gone to Carnegie Mellon as a graduate student in computer science, and I said to my advisor, I said, standards are how we communicate value, right? Our definitions are how we communicate value. And I said, there's no way that we're communicating to principals, to superintendents, to school districts, what we value in computer science education. And so we launched on the Running on Empty report project, where I read state standards in math, science, technology, you name it. I hunted for computer science standards embedded in all 50 states and created this national landscape report of how those states align to the CSTA standards at the time, and really categorize them to say, look, we're communicating value around the usage of technological components. Like almost every state had a standard that said kids would type on a keyboard. But almost no states had a standard around they'll understand what an algorithm is. And so that began a conversation about what are we communicating our values to school districts, from those of us who have content knowledge to those of us who are trying to teach our children. And it probably came full circle about a year and a half ago when, together with a number of people who are here in this room, who was a writer on the K-12 CS framework? I know there's a bunch of you here. Right? When we all came together and put together a clear and concise definition that was separated by grade band about what we value. And if we value something, this gets to your point of the for all, right? If we value something, if this is what children should learn, what all children should learn, then this is how we bring equity into the equation. You know that great little picture where it's like 3 boxes and 3 people, and you've got the short kid, the medium kid, and the tall kid, and they're trying to peer over the fence of the baseball game, right? And it says, equity is when you stack all the boxes under the really short kid. And I always want one more picture, right? I think there's a version of it with 3 where it's like justice is you take away the fence. And I actually want one more. I want it to be where the players on the field come teach them to play. It shouldn't be that we're stopped at watching, right? How do we push the boundaries through those communications of value? We don't want them just watching the technology or watching the innovations come through. We want them participating in the game. So how do we push those values through our communication of definitions of what it means? And without those definitions, how can we hold different regions to the same standard in order to ensure that equity happens? So we're working in New York City to do Computer Science for All, $81 million, 10-year project, and one of our core charges to our independent third-party evaluator is for any given kid in the system, are they equally likely to get just as rigorous computer science, irregardless of their zip code, their socioeconomic status, their ethnicity, like through all the stratifications we can possibly divide, will they be getting similar computer science exposure and experiences? And without a common definition of what that bar is across the city, the schools who are trying to implement don't know the targets they're shooting for. So we need to have those good definitions and those good values as a part of how we communicate equity.
All right, so Kyle, what's the definition of making? It seems like that's job one here.
I don't think there is a definition that everyone can agree on at this moment about what making is. I think we have lots of great words that we use to describe making, and I think that Maker Ed as an organization is working to figure out how to, if not define this is the thing, but to like hold a space that this is the container of making, and these are the things that happen in that container. I think that having a definition is probably going to be a journey. And the thing about definitions is that just because you have one today doesn't mean that tomorrow that definition is going to still hold water. Like this is an evolving conversation, and it's not a thing that once you say it is going to always be called it that way. And I think, you know, to talk a little bit about what equity means in this space, it's a really interesting moment because we're looking at a system that is built upon oppression, essentially, and we're talking about why that system isn't producing the same life outcomes for all people. And without being able for us to interrogate that system and why it is the way that it is, we can't really change the life outcomes for everybody. And I think to name things, and you know, I just want to like name a couple of things that I've noticed, which is that there's 3 white women on a panel, and when you asked people to raise their hands about who worked on the definition, in my quick track, it was white folks in the room who raised their hands, and these are the things that we need to be looking at and interrogating. I'm sure that there was more diversity on the whole thing, and this is a small sampling, but being able to sort of acknowledge, back to your question of like who's at the table, and that metaphor is really great, that we're not talking about just changing access points. We actually need to interrogate what access means, and that means that some people, and you know, this is I think some work that us white folks get to do, is we need to look at the table and say, is the table even the thing? Like maybe we should get rid of the table. Let's sit on the floor, and like let's figure out what it means to actually not just like include more people, but change the environment so that everyone is there from the beginning. And so that's, I think, what I'm excited about to really dig into with Maker Ed and with the making community is makers are everywhere. They look so different depending on where you are. And we want to make sure that it's not just a talking point, that it actually looks and feels like a diverse and vibrant, and we need each other, community.
So, you know, obviously, if you think about the work that Stephanie, you've been doing, there's an immense amount of opportunity when you're working with like invent teams around the country, where you have all the different programs you've built up. But what's your sense on when you're trying to move the needle on how you define the broader problem and the equity things, how much that's at the center and how much you're able to make traction on it?
Right. So for me, I am driven by the social equity issues that I see. Initially, I started out with technology and teaching and learning. Then it went to STEM, and now I'm really focused on the inequities that I see among prolific patent holders and leading technology innovators. If you have not heard the statistics, we have about 90% who are male in that category, and we have 95% who are Asian or white. Of the 5% diversity that are in the prolific patent holders and inventors, half of that is foreign-born. So when I dig in and try to look at the research of why do we have this outcome in the US, you know, a lot of it to me goes back to we have very divided communities. And those people who know how to invent, who have been embedded within the STEM ecosystem, perpetuate more people who are in their families going down those paths. And we don't have mechanisms in local communities where we intentionally cross-pollinate people to have the dialogic relationships that are needed to learn. Because that code doesn't teach, that piece of technology doesn't teach, and those tools in the makerspace don't teach. What will deal with the divides that we face is when we bring people together and get them working together and getting those with expertise to share and coach with those who don't. And that's why I'm driven by these models where you're finding problems to solve, you're working in teams, and young people from diverse backgrounds are working with more knowledgeable others who are not telling them what to do, but asking them the questions that lead them to come to know what to do. And I can give you example after example of where we've done that in our own program, but I am finding pockets of educators across the country who are using different models to do that kind of work. One I love is one I found in Iowa, where the school districts formed a consortium, and they all put teachers into the pool and hired one director who works with the mayor. The mayor beats up on the local businesses, gives the kids the problems that need to be solved and the money to build with. And then the kids are supported by these teachers in blocks of time, three class period blocks, a couple days a week. This is just one of many models, but there are people out there who are figuring it out. And so we all need to come together and organize around some common frameworks that are connecting our work and giving kids this opportunity for dialogue in the building of social networks with those who can help them get the jobs.
So this is a good segue into one of the other sort of things that I think came up in the questions that folks were asking, which is, there's great work happening in rural communities. There's great work happening in lots of areas. There's the old adage, there's no problem in America that someone else in America isn't already working on and has a solution for. It's just that those people aren't talking and it's not at scale. I guess one question, is, on one level, we all have a responsibility to be servant leaders, to think about not just our immediate goals, but also how are we putting more back into the community than we're putting in. But there's also a little bit of an organizational role that can come in. And I'd be just sort of curious, the sort of rise of the CS4All consortium as one case study, but what are ways that when you sort of said, hey, there's actually a lot happening in the computer science space, we can actually, by helping the doers who are doing the work, actually accelerate their work. And that's actually a really valuable role to play. What's your sense on whether the difficulties and upsides of that? And then it'd be interesting to sort of get thoughts on, do we need more of that at a broader lens when it comes to invention and making, that kind of thing?
It's really funny because the narrative that has driven this spotlight on CS education is probably the thing that hurts the most for schools that are implementing on the ground. This narrative that there's no computer science, there are no teachers, there are no schools, there are no students in classes, there's not enough people for the jobs, no one is doing it, your school doesn't have it, your kids don't have it. This deficit narrative is really what's driven a lot of the attention and focus, because people are like, oh my God, why don't we have this thing? But at the same time, it ignores some of the fantastic work that's going on the ground and a lot of the capacity that our educational institutions already have, right? I like to say with CS4All that we have to be really careful, because if we don't keep listening to our schools and to our implementers, we're going to keep solving year one problems in year 5. We're kind of in year 5. So we've been taking this framework approach with school districts. We have something called the script, which is a framework that schools can use to self-assess where they are with computer science education. No content knowledge needed in order to do it. In fact, I often say it's kind of crazy to me when I go to a school district and they're like, what should I do? I'm like, I don't know. You tell me. Like, you have 20 years of experience in this context, in this building with these students. You are a superintendent of schools. You have so much rich knowledge about what goes on in your building and what they need. My knowledge of what an if statement is, my knowledge of what a for loop is nothing compared to those 20 years, right? So that to me, that the placing all of the power in me and my choices is what that deficit narrative of, you have nothing, I know everything, you have to ask me for my answers. And so we launched the consortium. The very first thing we did was, like, Michael and I could have both used our brains and said, we've been working in New York, I've been working in CS Ed since early 2000s. We know what's going on, but we said, no, we don't know. So we interviewed 150 of our founding members of the consortium and said, what are you doing? What's your biggest problems right now? And we have this amazing picture of our office wall with all of this, how you do
it's like a beautiful mind
of
There's just
post-it notes, like all over the place. And then and then you sort it into the groups. And then the thing we did was we labeled all of those needs with the folks who are already doing a lot of that work. Oh, this big bucket here, NC-WITS got that down. Or this big bucket over here, Code.org and their state coalition is working on that. This big bucket here, that's actually the CSTA. And the thing that we came out, there were two things that really came out of that for us is one, storytelling and case studies. We needed better ways to translate the work on the ground of the small school district into the broader space, and a focus on school districts. This institution that drives a pathway for students through multiple years and probably through multiple curriculum, multiple programmatic partners, they have no support to try and put that work together. And that really launched a lot of our efforts at CS4All. And then we complement that with partnering with as many of the research projects that we can find or who want to become a part of the consortium to try and help translate those research best practices into practitioner-focused documents, which is, as everyone knows, one of the biggest problems in all of education everywhere. And so this balance between telling the stories, lifting up the small work on the ground, making it visible, the work that's happening, we do that partially through our summit, which is now open with call for commitments for next year. So you can go to summit.csforall.org and tell us great stories about what you're doing, and we can help share that with the nation, as well as our community calls, where we always have a panel of practitioners talking about the work as a part of the work they do for the broader community, telling stories. And for to translate that to what the maker community might need, again, for me, it comes back to how do we communicate value, right? The stories that we choose to lift, the things that we choose to share, are how we communicate value to the people peering in to see what is this about, and a great way to get around like those concise definitions into the like messy outcomes that we really want for kids that are about process and not product.
So, Stephanie, it'd be interesting to sort of get both from you and then from Kyle, just this notion of just continue to sort of unpack this question of what does more servant leadership in the makerspace look like? And there's different ways, I think, to think about it. Both is, what is that collective to-do list? What are the pain points? Obviously, we got a number from folks in the room. And then also this, I always, the reason why we were big believers in the commitments model in the White House days, and part of it was that it was a form factor for lifting up good work happening around the country, right? It was like, hey, we're not going to just host an event where we say, here's the report that we're issuing, or here are the grants we're issuing. We actually are going to make this a stage where lots of good work gets lifted up and announced, both to signal like there's a lot of good work, but also to give lots of folks on the ground an excuse and form factor for doing more work. I'd be curious how you all are sort of thinking about, if you're saying, what does servant leadership or invention look like, or in general, how do you sort of think about that?
Yeah. So I think it was Tom Khalil, actually, when he was with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and it was a meeting here with all the technology companies, and he said, look, guys, because it was mostly guys at the time, this was way back when.
Or might be today.
I hope not, but, and he said, we're all fighting a forest fire with eyedroppers. And we got to get outside our individual programs and more into a collective effort. And, you know, that was profound for me. It's always shaped my thinking. And I really do think we need to look at how to steward the whole entire pathway of a young person. This work has to start in preschool. There's a lot of research around that, starting in preschool in the early grades. Thanks to Chevron and Janet Auer, who's here, we have actually done a lot of that pathway building work in the East Bay here in California. There are other pockets where they've done a nice job as well. But we need to redouble those efforts to look in regional communities about how we're stewarding the pathway from preschool through college. And that's bigger servant leadership work to me. And the other thing is that I really feel like, you know, if we landed on the solution, we wouldn't be in this room today. So we have to keep innovating about what servant leadership and getting outside individual programs means, how we collaborate to make a change. And at the moment, you know, I've seen the value of people in science, technology, engineering, math. You could put making in there, stewarding the pathway for young people. But I guess what I'm getting visibility now of is that when we look at problems, young people want to be problem solvers and they want to make a difference in their community. And that motivates them for computer science and other pathways. And so that's maybe the part, we can never make STEM pathways sticky. Maybe that is how we make STEM pathways for young people sticky, is by building it back to their local relevance and connecting them to the adults in their community who can help them make a difference. And I've been in this job a year and a half. I've been researching our programs and the impact with the young people. And some of these young people are telling me, this is the first time in my whole life I've ever had a conversation with an adult about something serious that really matters. And these kids are telling me that in grades 11 and 12. That's pretty sad. But it tells you what's broken and what we need to fix at the community level.
So I think what I'll add to what you both have beautifully said is kind of a ripple of three things. One is starting with individual practice. So I think the role of an organization like Maker Ed as a national nonprofit that's supporting the professional development and training of teachers is really, how do we make this easier for individual teachers who, once they go into their room and the door is closed, are essentially, it's a solo act. And we're learning how to support their shift in teacher practice to become, you know, more allowing for student-driven and learner-driven educational opportunities. And then rippling out from there is the network. So that teacher is part of an ecosystem in a school, which is part of an ecosystem in a district and in a city and in a region. And I think an organization like Maker Ed can also be a kind of convener of a network and an organization that can help people, okay, yes, there are people who have figured out problems that I can't solve, and I need help being able to access and find those people. And then as a movement, advocacy, and figuring out how you move kind of on two continuums. One is, the individual, the decision maker, and the influencer, from understanding to a willingness to act to actually acting. And I think that's where the storytelling and the case studies come in, of having a platform where we can help tell the story of what is happening in Salinas and lift up those stories from the ground. And it's a feedback loop of supporting individual teachers in districts and in systems, and then making sure that our organization and our system can support the storytelling that is happening as a result of our engagement with those individuals and with those systems. There was one other thing that I wanted to say, but it's escaping me at the moment. So if it was important, I'll pull the mic back.
So this is a good moment for us to sort of take stock of the conversation here. And I would love to get, I'm going to ask Whitney again, if folks, based on what you've heard so far, if there are questions that pop up, things you want clarified, things that haven't gotten discussed that you're like, hey, how come this isn't getting discussed? Or just things you want to sort of add into the conversation. I would love to do another round of collecting your thoughts and questions so that we can continue to enrich the conversation. Same as always, name, organization, and
Hi, everyone. I'm a AAAS fellow at NSF. And my question...
Nameless.
Your name,
Keisha.
please.
My name is Keisha. Keisha Ashes, right here. So my question is around the role of parents. So I haven't heard that mentioned at all, and I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Great. Who else?
One thing, it's more of an observation, and it just, like this light bulb just went off during the conversation, especially comparing and contrasting CS and making. I was surprised that, I mean, as a Hispanic growing up in Texas, in what would have been considered an under-resourced school, et cetera, and at risk, that a larger or a different community, majority community, would think that making is not, like, I need access to making, when making was a necessity. So it's not that it didn't exist, it's that we weren't going for patents, we weren't going for recognition, we weren't going for the entrepreneurship. Sometimes it would happen, but it was just a necessity of life that we made things. I made my skateboard. I made things like that because we didn't go out and buy them. Exactly, and so it just went off, and so the CS component of it, which when I was introduced to CS, it wasn't an area that my counselor in school recommended I go after, because it wasn't assumed that my being a Hispanic, I would go after CS. So it's exposure to that, but that Venn diagram, the commonality is the science portion, the science and inquisition and the discovery portion, inquiry portion, that I think is a commonality. So it's like, yes, I did make because I had to, but the CS was a natural extension of that making concept. So it was just something that just occurred to me. So I'd like to see, I'm interested to see how that can be built into the conversation.
That's great. Yes.
And then behind you. Thanks. So I'm Shailene or Shay Pokris from the Museum of Science, Boston. And it's good that I will talk before you because thank you for that comment. I think it shows exactly why it's important to have a diverse group of people in the room, because many of us will be sitting here talking and not knowing the experiences of someone who grew up in the place you did with that observation. And as you said that, I realized I did a lot of making as a child because we didn't have a lot of money, and my dad would just pull out the saw and the hammer, and I still know how to do things today that my husband doesn't know how to do because of things like that. But the comment I was going to make before your comment was about how the reason I even came into this session, my background is computer science education. I came to this session to hear more about where maker ed and computer science go together, which I think is where we're all starting to realize needs to happen, and that I myself am starting to realize needs to happen, and that I might have started to get there recently when I started to embrace robotics, which I used to think was too boyish, and I didn't want to go there because I thought it excluded girls. And then I started to embrace physical computing, which I had not in the past, because I thought that it was too, like, they're exposed wires and stuff, and it's not all kids will think that that's cool, and it might not be inclusive. And the reason I embraced those things was because of those aha moments. Like, kids have screens all around them now. It's not enough to just make something move across the screen. They need to have an aha moment. Watching the video last night about Maker Ed, I saw the aha moments on the girls' faces in the video. I thought, that's what I always go for when I'm working with kids. So they're having those in their maker spaces too. When they weld something together, that's an aha moment. We can pull all of this together and have the makers keep going with the CS Ed, and have the CS Ed kids keep going with making. So let's do that. And that was more of an observation, but I think many of us see this is where we need to go, but I'm not totally sure how we're going to get there. Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Jones-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Nation of Makers, and I wanted to play off of what Albert said. So I want to push back on the, I think definitions are useful, and Kip and Stephanie Santoso and I and Dale were on a conversation to define, to have a federal definition of a makerspace at one point because Congress needed it to be able to put forth legislation. So definitions are important, but it was a terribly hard discussion. I mean, we went back and forth for a while, and we were under a time crunch, so we came up with something. But I think to Albert's point, and this is also how I grew up, and I'm part Native, and I, remember, making in my culture, and then coming to the maker movement and thinking, well, that's not considered making in mainstream, America, and that's a problem, right? So when we're having the for all conversation, limiting ourselves to a particular definition actually can cripple us immensely. And so, I do understand that we do need definitions to be able to push forward policy. I, have worked in DC for a while now and understand the role of policy and definition in that process. But I do think that in order for us to truly be inclusive, we need to push our school systems. It's sort of that idea of like, do we change the picture? So what Kyle was saying, do we get rid of the table? Like, are we thinking about things in a different way? Do we challenge our school systems to say, hey, something, here is a list of all the kinds of things instead of a definition, or here is a myriad of ways that you can see, that students that are in your school system already are making. So instead of saying, let's bring, this Arduino kit to your kids, which is fine to do that, let's have a conversation about, how the making that they're doing relates, and that mindset relates to the type of making that we want to teach in schools, or, to computer science principles and things like that. And I think there are some really great examples. Community Science Workshop, I'm a proud board member there, and I think that they're doing a really great job of integrating sort of farm making, or making that would happen on a farm in a rural community with, what we might consider more mainstream making. And I just want to push us to think a little bit bigger instead of trying to fit into the systems that occur. I mean, we're makers, let's shake up the system and change it, right?
Well, let's keep collecting. And then I know this panel will have lots of feedback.
My question has changed about 8 times since I raised my hand. So let's see if I can put something together. First of all, I do wonder how many of those opportunities to make still exist, and whether those are slipping away from us, from the loss of the CTE space workshop.
That is it over since the 1980s to now. That is why we're rediscovering.
And moving those spaces more to an academic frame. But going back to making it in CS, one of the real overlaps I see is the opportunity to partner outside of the traditional academic education spaces. And one thing that hasn't been brought up that is really driving the conversation around CS for sure is the need for jobs. When you go and look at the narrative of why CS is important, a lot of it is about industry needs. When you go and talk to educators, I don't think that comes to the top of the list. We're much more interested in agency and student empowerment and building the voice. So, and this also appears in making. So how can we kind of learn from those two to make that a useful sort of interaction? And the other comment is thinking about making as more of the space and the community that's working, and the CS and the engineering, those as more of those where we need more of the definitions. What is the CS and the engineering that's happening in those spaces? But making what we've done at UTeach is really want to bring a space for teachers to explore their passions and bring them into their classrooms.
What's your name?
Mike DeGraff from UT Austin.
It's not actually an extra thing. I'm just going to add, I'm Shelly Rodriguez. I'm with UTeach Maker at UT Austin. And we're having a conversation about who's not at the table. And I will say, I'm fairly new to the whole community in general. I'm more of a teacher educator, a recent maker advocate. But whenever I get together at maker functions, there are primary groups that stand out to me every time. And so it's the engineers, it's the computer scientists, STEM educators, and arts. And I think the arts is the group that it is maybe, I don't know, are there people here from the arts, but that's the group that I see a lot of potential overlap with as well.
That's great. With somebody in the back. Yes. The panel is so eager.
Yes. Thank you. You touched on this somewhat, but I'd really
Your
love...
name?
Oh, I'm David Cavallo, and I'm currently flowing through the Fab Foundation. You touched on it somewhat in terms of the tension. As things get to be for all, often it winds up not high quality for all, which was a lot of the reason for getting things started in the first place. And Stephanie mentioned something about who, which often doesn't get talked about, who you get to work with counts for a lot. And you mentioned about form factors. But what often happens as you see things spread is that by the time you're doing it and people are in short supply that both have the deep ideas and know how to work with people, and especially kids. So how do you try to, resolve this tension such that as things do grow, they don't become not what they were supposed to be about in the first place?
Great. One last one.
And Kumar, just so you know, we have about 7 minutes.
Great. We are rolling, people.
Thanks. I'm Adam Maltese from Indiana University, Bloomington. And one of the tensions that we're finding is actually this notion of sort of scaling. Even in Indiana, a small state, we've started a network of maker educators, right? People thinking that they're by themselves, but not realizing that there's somebody next door doing this. And we were talking about this morning, trying to get beyond this notion of, oh, I want to do, as they say, typically maker. So are there kits? Are there lesson plans? Are there things that I can do? And we keep trying to push back on them while also supporting them to say, that's okay at a small degree, but the whole idea is that you can take on challenges that are outside of anything traditional. And then going back to something Keisha said before, also trying to bring in the whole ecosystem of, yes, there are opportunities for kids from underserved groups to participate in making, but typically they're one-off, and when those kids go home, they likely don't have access to similar resources that the kids from higher SES families or communities have. And so it is a huge, massive problem, but trying to think about how everyone can play a role in trying to address that to really make it a more equitable situation is something where we're trying to wrap our heads around.
Great. And just, I think we'll close with this final round with the panel. One thing I sort of predicted that this conversation would last past the amount of time that we had allocated. Steph Santoso is organizing a conversation at 5 o'clock today near the Redwoods area for folks who want to continue this conversation.
Worth it. She changed it to 5.
There's
a second email.
Yeah. So she's organizing right near the Redwoods where the panel conversation on folks who want to continue to think about intersections between Maker and CS and this whole question of servant leadership around Make for All. So that'll be a chance to continue the conversation. So a bunch of things got thrown out. One is this question around, there's a bunch of who's missing conversations. That's one. There's a second conversation around, part of this is about authenticity and you meet students where they are, you meet children where they are, you get these opportunities in lots of ways, and how do we recognize that and actually say, hey, you're doing something really interesting here, that's actually real, and let's build on that. And then there's a question around this question of, the last round of questions also touched on this, there's all these formal systems where either you're, it's like either you're playing in those systems or you're not getting to leverage the time and resources of those systems. So I'm not saying we're going to solve these questions, but these are questions that people in general are trying to deal with, which is we have an education system that is accountability-based, that has result systems that employers, policymakers, and others are trying to say, well, what do I get from these systems? And then there's all these people who are saying, well, we're trying to build agency and meet children where they are and actually help them go on their path. And so you all are, I'm not saying that these are necessarily solvable, but it'd be curious, Leigh, and sort of what your reaction is to this challenge. It's just, I'm sure this exists in computer science too. It's like people are doing lots of things, and how do you sort of recognize that while also thinking about it as a broader movement?
Yeah, my biggest thing to the room, and if this is our final round, I would say don't get lost in your expert blind spots. There is a desire to say making is this rich and fundamental activity, and we were the same thing with computer science. Like, it's computational thinking is anything where you're thinking with a computer, right? And we fall into a little bit of this, we'll know it as a community when we see it, when it meets our values. And yet, you have this teacher who believes in the narrative that we've created around what making can do for students. But she doesn't know it when she sees it. She's the blind man in a fine art museum. How do we create a way for her, just like we wouldn't turn a 10-year-old loose in a maker lab with no support and no supervision from the beginning and expect them to make something rigorous and amazing using multiple technological tools and outcomes from the beginning. We have to scaffold that teacher. And even though they might choose a kit to start with in year 1, they will grow into a fundamental understanding of the values of the community over time. And while the teacher develops a richness of understanding, her students will get a more experienced, more advanced teacher in the pathway. My PhD was a lot about feedback. And so how can that teacher understand her own practice and get better if we're not helping her see the paintings on the wall? If we're not helping her know what it is when we see it? And so I think that there's a little bit of the expert blind spot that we're communicating this to novices, not just novice students, but also novice arbiters of the work as we go to scale. And so how do we think about growth of that teacher? Growth of that system. What's the feedback mechanism in the system so that the system knows it's doing a good or poor job and has to shift and address, right? And so some of that is, like, as a blind man in a museum, how did you translated the work that you did as a child now with reflection into understanding that was making? But for many of our students in underrepresented communities, they can't make that explicit translation. And expecting them to do that on their own is what got us into the computer sciences rocket science bucket in the first place. The reason we are pushing computer science in formal education is because we need an instructor to say, yes, that's tying your shoes is an algorithm, and here's why. They need those connection making in order to take the natural activity that inquisitive kids do every day into the productive career-based skills that'll lead them into being rigorous inventors and to have the self-confidence to file the patent for the cool thing they made. So I think that's my caution, is don't get lost in our expert blind spots and realize that our students who need this the most also need someone to directly translate our values to them so that they can be part of that feedback cycle and know that they are exceptional.
So Kyle, you sort of described this as a container. Maker Edis thinks, and there's a whole question about audiences. Parents are an audience, children themselves are an audience, employers are an audience, all these different audiences. How do you speak to many audiences at the same time? As your sort of as your thoughts on big goal, but then also many audiences that arrive with different goals for what they want out of a particular topic?
Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my interview process for this job. So Dale Doherty, who is our board chair and the founder of Maker Ed, who we'll hear from tonight, I said something in my interview about how I couldn't figure out what the pedagogical approach to making was, and that I thought that was a problem, and that being able to participate in the institution and educational spaces by using the language that those systems are using is really important if you're bringing what you think is a new idea into that space. And Dale, in my interview, said, I really want to push back on that. And I said, okay, great. Like, okay, here we go. And then he said, I feel really worried about writing it down because it's not about like staking a claim. It's this open invitation to create. And we sort of moved on from there. And then later he asked me to come to his office before they offered me the job. And I thought, oh gosh, this is going to be the moment where I don't get it because I'm going to say something that offends him. But really what I walked away from that conversation understanding was his concern about claiming making as an attachment to standards, and that we could align making, that in order for us to get the buy-in from the institution, we needed, I think we need to be able to say, like, this actually does support next generation science standards. It does support Common Core. And we haven't talked about standards on this panel yet, but I do think that our ability to align with it's a good thing that the next generation science standards are more forward-thinking. They're not a bunch of factoid things. This is a very specific idea that I have about looking at the next generation science standards and saying, okay, there's 8 scientific practices and there's cross-cutting concepts that are interdisciplinary in nature. And in the middle, there's these disciplinary core ideas where it's like, these are the content things that we want kids to walk away with. And what would it look like for us to switch out the disciplinary core ideas in science and specific topics to making or to computer science, that we want to not create a separate thing, but to work within what exists to change the system. And what I walked away from that conversation with Dale was thinking, this guy is like really subversive in a way that I really like, and is totally surprising to me that he doesn't want to put making in schools. He wants making to change schools. And I think that figuring out how we align and get in order to like shift and dismantle and rebuild is the inquiry that I am bringing to this work and that I'm really excited about.
Great. All right, so we are basically out of time. Stephanie, you get the last word. What's the answer?
So quickly, I've been trying to write a research paper that does what you say, those intersections, and it's a murky middle. We are all together in the same space. The Venn diagram overlaps when you look at science and engineering standards, making and inventing and entrepreneurship.
That should be the name of this panel, the murky middle.
The murky middle. And so I guess what I'd like to say is, I really would encourage a broader tent building effort to do what you just said, to make advances where we are uniting making, inventing, and we haven't really talked a lot about it, but entrepreneurship. And so I do have some postcards on the front chair here of a conference that we're doing with invention education champions, with the community college systems entrepreneurship group across the state, and also the National Association of Community College Entrepreneurship. And we're trying to bring in those people from different areas across the U.S. where they're really trying to build that pathway for making, inventing, and entrepreneurship.
Sorry, I know, you're getting mad, but I just want to say one more thing because I feel like the parent question is really important and we didn't get to it. And so I want to just say one quick thing about that, which is that parents are makers. They are makers out of necessity. They are makers out of creativity. They are makers because they have to get dinner on the table and they have to get backpacks together, all of that. And the way that I have learned to engage parents is to make sure that kids are seen, respected, excited about their work at school, and that they want to include their parents in that process. And that's the best way to the parents is through the excitement, engagement, and respect of kids.
I want to thank all of you and this incredible panel.